I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window of my downtown apartment, the late afternoon sunlight spilling across my silk blouse, when my phone buzzed insistently. The kids were laughing in the background, building another one of their chaotic block towers, oblivious to the tension creeping into my chest. I picked it up, already dreading the message I knew would be there. It was from my sister, Julia. Another party. Another event where, apparently, my kids weren't invited. My thumb hovered over the screen, a mix of disbelief and a bitter chuckle rising from my throat. I had expected it, yet the sting felt sharper than before. Excluding my children intentionally, without a word. I leaned back, listening to the soft hum of the city below, the smell of coffee still lingering from my morning cup. I could feel my heart thudding in that odd mix of pride and simmering irritation. On the surface, I was composed, polished, the woman who'd carved out her life from nothing, but this little message reminded me that some wounds never fully fade. A part of me wanted to reply immediately, to snap at Julia for her pettiness, but another, steadier part, the one that had survived being dismissed, overlooked and underestimated, told me to pause, to observe, to plan, because sometimes the sweetest victories are the ones no one sees coming. And today I decided I wasn't just going to sit quietly and let her hurt linger. I remember that night vividly, even though it had been years ago. I was younger then, just starting to navigate the messy, unpredictable world of motherhood while trying to hold onto my own dreams. Julia had invited everyone to her lavish anniversary party, everyone but us. My children. My heart had twisted as I held the invitation, the small print glaringly clear. Adults only. I knocked on her door anyway, hoping it was some cruel oversight. The look on her face when she saw me at the threshold told me all I needed to know. A mixture of irritation and condescension. "I thought you'd understand," she said with that sweet, venomous smile of hers. Understand? Understand that my children, my pride and joy, weren't good enough to sit among her carefully curated crowd? I stood there, frozen, my hands trembling so violently I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. The lump in my throat made speaking impossible, and I watched her turn away, dismissing me with a casual flick of her wrist. Humiliation seeped into my bones. I felt the sting of rejection, the kind that makes you question your worth in ways you never forget. It was my grandmother who called me that night, sensing my despair even from miles away. Her voice, warm and steady, broke through the storm of my thoughts. "Darling, sometimes people's cruelty shows you what you're capable of," she said. "Use it. Build something no one can ever take from you." She handed me a small, worn notebook, its leather cover cracked but resilient. "Fill this with your dreams," she whispered.
Plan.
"Persist. And never let anyone decide your children's place in the world, or yours." That night, sitting at my tiny kitchen table while my kids slept fitfully in their crib, I opened the notebook. The blank pages stared back at me like a challenge, daring me to rise above the humiliation, to fight, to prove that being excluded was only fuel for my fire. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, I had made a decision. I would stop waiting for validation from anyone who refused to see my worth. I would carve my own path, not just for me, but for my children. And I would do it quietly, patiently, with the kind of resolve that doesn't announce itself but cannot be ignored. Those early days were the hardest. I balanced daycare drop-offs, late-night feedings, and a part-time job that barely covered the bills, all while scribbling plans and dreams into that leather notebook my grandmother had given me. Every empty page felt like a promise. One day, I would turn these words into reality. I met Claire, a seasoned graphic designer, at a small networking event I almost skipped because I was too exhausted to leave the kids with a babysitter. She saw something in me, a raw, unpolished potential that I barely recognized in myself. "You have vision," she said, handing me her business card. "Don't let anyone else define your limits. Let me help you." That single moment shifted everything. We worked nights after my children were asleep. Coffee became my lifeline, the smell of it mixing with the soft lullabies playing in the background. I taught myself digital design, learned the ins and outs of marketing, and slowly began building a portfolio. The first time a client paid me more than I ever imagined, my hands shook so violently, I almost dropped the invoice. But it wasn't just money, it was proof. Proof that I could survive, thrive, and do it all on my own terms. The small wins kept stacking. A local boutique commissioned a line of illustrations for their store. A startup hired me to design their branding, and every tiny success felt like a secret victory, hidden from Julia and the rest of my family. I posted modest photos on social media, coffee cups on my desk, stacks of papers, my kids coloring nearby, but never the full truth of what I was building. They didn't need to know. There were nights I cried from sheer exhaustion, when the balancing act of motherhood and ambition felt impossible. Self-doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest, whispering that I wasn't enough. But then I would look at the notebook, filled now with sketches, plans, and milestones, and I would remember my grandmother's words. Use their doubt as fuel. Persist. Never let anyone decide your worth. By the time my children were old enough to ask questions about mommy's work, I had built a small business that was quietly flourishing. I rented a modest office downtown, decorated it with the art and personal touches that reflected my journey. I hired my first assistant, then another, and eventually, we began taking larger projects that paid more than I had ever dreamed. Each success was a step further away from the sting of that childhood humiliation, each dollar a quiet declaration of independence. What was most satisfying, though, was keeping it secret. My family still assumed I was struggling, juggling small part-time jobs. Little did they know that the woman they dismissed, the woman whose kids they excluded, was quietly, meticulously building an empire. And with every completed project, every satisfied client, I felt the fire inside me grow, stronger, sharper, ready for the moment when the world, and my sister, would finally see the truth. The invitation arrived quietly, slipped under my door in an envelope I almost ignored. Julia's next party. This time, I made a choice. I would attend, not as the struggling sister, not as the overlooked mother, but as someone who had quietly built a life she could never have imagined. When I arrived, I parked a little farther down the street, letting the valet guide my sleek black SUV inside. The faint clink of her expensive crystal glasses greeted me as I stepped through the front door, and the scent of orchids and candle wax filled the grand entryway. Julia, radiant and unbothered, floated toward me with her signature smile. "Oh, you came," she said, feigning surprise. I nodded politely, ignoring the subtle tension in the air. I did. I had arranged for a small business showcase at the party, disguised as a casual conversation about my work. But as my sister greeted her friends and neighbors, I let them notice the first hints: the expensive portfolio tucked under my arm, the subtle branding on my laptop bag, the elegance of my dress, the air of quiet authority I carried without even trying. A few minutes in, curiosity began to spread like wildfire. Guests leaned in to ask questions, whispering about the success they hadn't expected. I smiled, answering them with calm, effortless confidence. And then I turned to Julia, letting my gaze linger a little longer. "Surprised?" I asked softly, almost teasingly, as she stared, her carefully constructed composure faltering. She tried to speak, to deny, to dismiss, but the words caught in her throat. I reached into my bag and pulled out the latest project presentation for my firm, hundreds of pages detailing contracts, profits, and clients she'd never have imagined. The room went silent as I laid it out on the coffee table, my fingers lightly brushing the glossy covers. "This is what I've been building," I said. Quietly, patiently. "While my kids and I were excluded from your parties, I built something you never thought we could. Something you couldn't ignore." The reactions were immediate. Gasps, murmurs of disbelief, and some stifled applause. Julia's face went pale. Her eyes darted from my confident smile to the documents, then to the small digital screen on my laptop, displaying a series of successful campaigns and bank statements proving my net worth. She opened her mouth to speak, and I let her struggle. Let her feel the weight of her assumptions, the years of dismissal and exclusion, finally reflected back at her. I had no idea," she stammered. "And now you do. I replied, my voice soft but firm. You see, while you were deciding who is worthy of your attention, my children and I were building a life that doesn't depend on anyone's approval, including yours. The room had shifted. The party, once all about her image, was now an audience to my quiet triumph. People whispered about the woman they thought they knew, about the mother they assumed was struggling, and the power she had held all along. Julia's friends looked at her in a new light, their pity now gone, replaced by a dawning respect for the sister she had underestimated. And in that moment, I realized something. The revenge I had been planning wasn't about humiliation or anger. It was about unveiling the truth, about reclaiming space, about showing, finally, that being underestimated had only made me stronger. Standing there, watching Julia's face shift from shock to quiet shame, I realized the real power wasn't in proving her wrong, it was in deciding what came next. I had the upper hand, and for the first time in years, I could set the terms. Julia, I said, my voice calm but unwavering, I'm not here to punish you. But things need to change if we're going to have a relationship at all. Her eyes widened, and I saw the fear creeping in, the same fear I had felt for years when I had nothing but my own determination. I took a deep breath, thinking not just about her, but about every small exclusion, every dismissive remark, every time my children had been left out. First, I continued, if my kids are going to be part of family events, it will be with respect. No more whispers, no more exclusions. They are part of this family whether you like it or not. And if you want them at your parties, you'll treat them like they belong. She nodded hesitantly, swallowing hard, and I pressed on. Second, I want honesty. No more backhanded compliments, no more passive-aggressive digs. We start over with truth. And then, softer but firm, I added, third, I want you to pursue something that makes you proud, not just trying to outshine someone else. You need a purpose beyond competition, and I'm willing to support you if you take it seriously. There was a pause, and I let the silence linger. The guests had begun to sense the shift in energy. This was no longer a typical family drama. This was transformation happening in real time. Finally, I looked at her and said, I care about you, Julia. I always have. But I will not let toxic patterns dictate my life, or my children's. If you choose to embrace change, we can build something stronger. If not, well, we'll continue as we are, and I'll protect my family, quietly, the way I always have. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the mix of regret and recognition of the opportunity before her. The power had shifted, yes, but it wasn't vengeance alone that mattered. It was choice, accountability, and growth. And in setting these boundaries, I was also granting her the chance to grow, to reclaim the love and respect she had overlooked for so long. As the room settled, I felt a strange, liberating calm. This wasn't about triumph over her. It was about reclaiming my space, my dignity, and my family's place in a world that had once doubted us. I realized that the greatest revenge isn't about humiliation. It's about strength, generosity, and refusing to allow old wounds to dictate your future. For the first time in a long time, I felt fully untethered from the past. The power was mine, and the path ahead, both for me and those who truly wanted to grow, was clear. Weeks passed after that party, and the shift I had set in motion began to ripple quietly through our family. Julia approached me with a humility I hadn't expected, asking questions about my work, genuinely curious, and even proud in her own way. She had started pursuing a small venture of her own, something meaningful that didn't revolve around comparison or exclusion. Watching her grow reminded me of my grandmother's words, sometimes people's cruelty shows you what you're capable of. My children, once sidelined and overlooked, were now embraced with warmth and inclusion. They laughed at family dinners without fear of being dismissed, and I saw in their eyes the reflection of my own resilience. It was a subtle joy, but one that filled me completely. I often returned to that leather notebook, now worn and filled with sketches, ideas, and milestones. It had been my silent witness, my guide, and my reminder that patience and persistence could transform humiliation into empowerment. The notebook wasn't just a symbol of my journey. It was a testament to every challenge we had overcome, every insult we had turned into fuel, and every quiet victory that had led to this moment. There were days when old memories surfaced, the sting of exclusion, the quiet embarrassment, the moments of self-doubt, but each time I reminded myself of how far we had come. I had become a woman who could stand firmly in her own success, fiercely protect her children, and extend compassion without compromising her boundaries. One afternoon, as I watched my kids build towers of blocks by the window, I realized the truth I had been chasing all these years. Revenge wasn't about making Julia feel small. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my joy. It was about showing, through action rather than words, that exclusion could never define our worth. And so I smiled, sipping my coffee, feeling the sunlight on my skin, listening to the laughter of my children, and knowing that this life of resilience, love, and quiet triumph was exactly where I was meant to be. Sometimes, the sweetest victories are the ones you don't announce, the ones you live fully and unapologetically. And in that moment, I knew that my family, my children, and I had not just survived exclusion. We had risen above it, stronger than ever. Bottom of form.